Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest, Dr. Mike Nelson. He is a research fueled nutrition and fitness educator, and that is in his own words on his website. Love that. He also has a PhD in exercise physiology, a BA in natural science, and an MS in biomechanics. And he's also an adjunct professor and member of the American College of Sports Medicine, ACSM. So Dr. Mike, thank you for coming on today. Looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, like I was telling you off air, I had heard about you a while back. We were at the same conference, and then ever since then, I'd seen you at multiple conferences, seen you speak at multiple ones. So really looking forward to chatting with you today about a couple topics that I know you talk about are in your wheelhouse: metabolic flexibility, and if we have time, getting into some HRV talk. But before we do that, do you mind just maybe briefly telling the audience about your background in this industry?
Yeah, so I started off like probably most guys, trying to get stronger, gain some size. Even my first year in college, I was a 6'3" eel-shaped rake. I still weighed 156. Got crushed by the empty bar in high school. Figured maybe I should do some of this lifting stuff. I remember signing up for a class at my undergrad, and I was super excited because they had to take physical education requirements. And so I'm like, I'll take a class on weight training. This is great. I'll actually learn what to do. So the guy comes in on the first day and he's, all right, some of you need to lose weight. And he looks around and he goes, and holy crap, he's like pointing at me, some of you need to gain weight. I'm like, oh, okay. And I wasn't like a very lean 156 either. So then he proceeded to leave and we never saw him again. It was just the TA who took attendance and I still had no idea what I was doing. So I just started doing random stuff, reading magazines. And I also took anatomy and physiology as my undergrad. And at the college, St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, any undergrad could sign up for anatomy and physiology, and you got to use actual cadavers. And they got new cadavers like every quarter at that time, which was really unheard of. Like most of the time, you had to be in a physical therapy program or a graduate degree to get cadavers that frequent. And the guy who taught the class, that was like the only class probably I've ever taken where I could just sit there and, oh, this kind of made sense. And you could actually go see the physical models and stuff too. So I decided that was pretty interesting, but I didn't know what to do with it. I ended up doing kind of a dual degree, then went on to Michigan Tech to do engineering. I worked for a medical device cardiac company for about 10 years after that. I did a short stint doing a PhD in biomedical engineering, did that for, 5 years. Decided I didn't want to do math anymore, and then went over to the exercise physiology department. And that took me 7 years to get my PhD there. Started training people officially and I got my CSCS in 2000. Worked at a commercial gyms for a little while. Decided that I didn't really want to do that the rest of my life, and nothing bad against it. The place I was at filed bankruptcy, didn't tell me. So I had to run around chasing clients, pretending not to be their trainer for a period of time, and just said, screw this. I'll buy some equipment and just put it in my garage. My backup plan, this was, 15 years ago now. My backup plan was, if this fails miserably and no one wants to train in some weirdo's garage, then I have a really nice gym in my garage. And it turns out people actually did. And some people actually liked it better because no one knew they were there. No one saw them. There wasn't any sort of weird perceptions or anything like that. So I called up Jim Lundler when he was working at Elite FDS at the time and asked him, I said, hey, here's how much money I have. What should I get? And he's, just get a 2x2 rack, straight bar, trap bar, flat bench. And then we talked about death metal and he told me to take more testosterone for the next hour and a half. If anyone who's met Jim, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, so just started doing that. And then probably 10 years ago, transitioned everything to online. And then right now I do some online training, although I don't have too many spots open usually ever. And then I do mentorship, which is a Flex Diet mentorship. I also have the certifications, which I'm sure we'll talk about, Flex Diet Cert and the Physiologic Flexibility Certification. And then in the process, working on a couple books. I do some part-time work for the guys over at Rapid Health. So Dr. Andy Galpin and Garner, the Barbell Shrug guys, which has been super fun. And I'm an associate professor at the Carrick Institute they do primarily clinical neuroscience. And I do more work there with a little bit more on the exercise side and special programs for them on the intersection of nutrition and neurology. So I do a research review every year, and then I did a program on the use of ketones, ketone esters, and ketogenic diet potentially for concussion and traumatic brain injury.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. It sounds like, yeah, a great background, ton of knowledge and experience. And I guess to follow up with that, looking at your stuff, it seems like you're a little bit more on like body composition, I think is something that you definitely focus on, but also the performance side of things is something that you really focus on. Do you work with like more like athletes? Is it more like kind of gen pop? What do you typically find is like your kind of clientele? I know you don't really do as much coaching anymore. You don't have a lot of space, but I was just wondering what that looks like there for you.
Yeah, so I've done a lot of general population in the past, all the way up through elite level professional athletes. Most of the clients I train now on my own are, I'd say, higher level athletes, not too many elite athletes anymore. That gets into time constraints and who else I'm working with, which sometimes there's too many cooks in the kitchen and I want to pull my hair out and it's just not worth it, to be 100% honest. Sometimes it's great, but all is it's a kind of a case by case basis. Most of them are actually trainers. I'd say probably 70% of them right now are trainers themselves. So helping them with their program design, nutrition, and most of them are very knowledgeable. They know what's going on, but it's just a lot easier a lot of times when you're super busy to just outsource it to somebody else. It's the quote of, was it Lincoln's quote? I think if you have yourself as your own client, you're an idiot or something like that.
Yep.
It is very tricky, I think, to
It is.
program for yourself because you'll tend to gravitate towards the stuff you want to do and away from the stuff you don't want to do. And it's very easy to keep changing goals all the time. But yeah, so that's been super fun. So right now I work with Anders, who works at Barbell Shrug, Mark Fisher, a bunch of other trainers, and it's been super fun.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's cool. Like you said, I agree. Having somebody else take care of the programming, even if you're like super smart and you enjoy doing it, it's just nice to put that out and let somebody else take care of it. Cause like you said, you end up doing the things that you don't necessarily want to do. And then, like you said, you're flip-flopping goals and everything like that. Cool. And I know you mentioned too, research. I think you said you do some research reviews. Are you like actively doing any other like type of research? Would you consider that doing active research? I'm just curious to hear about that.
I do some stuff. Like I still do peer reviews. I just did one for ISSN the other day. Presented at the International Society of Sports Nutrition Conference in June. Presented at the Neurosports Conference this past January. So I do some of that stuff. And then I helped with a review on the effects of coffee and caffeine. This one was more of a review on coffee. So I just was I wasn't the main author on that. And then the last big study I did was a position stand for the ISSN on caffeine and performance. I was like the third author on that, which, oh God, it took me like 3 years of my life, which, yeah. And then the research reviews I do through the Carrick Institute. So I take 12 studies and just give an overview of the overlap between nutrition and neurology. And then I'm also doing some work for Tecton. So they make ketone ester. So I'm helping them with kind of coordination of studies. So they're doing everything from performance research to potentially concussion. So what does literature say? What would be a better direction to go? Like, who are the best people in the world doing this research? Kind of helping them coordinate that so that it makes sense all the way through the continuum. And there's some really interesting stuff I think ketone esters can do because you don't have to necessarily be on a ketogenic diet in order to do it. And there's a lot of, I'd say, unanswered questions with that too. So I'll be doing a lot more of that stuff coming up also.
Awesome. That's super cool. Yeah, it sounds all really interesting. And I know you mentioned this multiple times too. You're a black coffee drinker as well too. Like you said, you like all things black shirts, black coffee, and you said death metal too, right? That's your go-to there. Big coffee fan as well here. So any type of research around coffee is always super interesting to me. So cool. Yeah, no, again, great background, and you can definitely tell that you are all in on this in this industry. Again, you put out great work. Just to switch gears a little bit. What does training and nutrition look like for you? And you can just maybe hit on what you're currently training for and maybe what that's just maybe evolved around, like how it's evolved over time as well.
Yeah, maybe it's because I don't want to say I'm getting older, but I'll be 49 in a few days, but I don't feel like I'm 49, which I guess is good. That's probably a good thing. Probably with goals, just looking from a higher level. So my main overarching goal would be related to kiteboarding, which I try to do a fair amount of. We usually go down to South Padre in the fall and in the spring and do a few other trips, and we'll hopefully be down in Mexico for a couple of weeks next year. So for me, most of the training is geared to that as a top priority. When I have the opportunity to go kiteboard, can I go ride for, I think the longest I've ridden in a row is over 4 hours for 73 miles, just going back and forth in a little Bay Area because it's fun. And I don't want to be physically limited by that. So usually we have little tracking devices and stuff. And so normally I'll be like one of the top people for like distance, road, and that kind of stuff. And then working on doing more jumps. So my goal this year is I did hit a 20-foot jump on my last trip, which was great. But now just trying to make that more consistent. And the longest distance so far I've gone is 188 feet, I think, which is pretty fun. If you've ever done any jumps like mountain biking or snowboarding or skiing or whatever, like even being in the air for like just a couple seconds feels like eternity, much less going 20 feet up for 5+ seconds is pretty fun, especially when you land it. It doesn't go so well if you don't land it. That's brutal. So that's the main goal. And then on a day-by-day basis, my second goal is to pick up the 170-pound Thomas Inch dumbbell. If you're familiar with that, it's an old school cast dumbbell, and the handle is 2 3/8 inches. So the handle's like the width of a pop can. And because it's all one cast piece, and because the handle is so thick, it's ridiculously hard to pick up. So I think Bird Sorinex usually has a booth a lot of times at like these big festivals like the Arnold and other things. And he's famous for sticking a $100 bill under the end of the dumbbell. And he's like, anyone who can pick this up, who's obviously not a elite competitor competing there, I'll give you the $100 bill. I think he said he's almost like never given it out. And it's funny to just hang out there and watch like these huge sides of beef with eyes come up. And because the people who lift like 175-pound one-hand deadlift, it's not really that heavy. It's very doable. But when you put that thick of a handle on it and it's a cast material, the grip becomes really hard. So not only do you have to support the grip, you have to use your thumb to basically stop the rotation of the bell. And it's the rotation that makes it really a difficult lift. So been working on that for a couple of years, probably 7 years now. So right now on a good day, I've got a replica that's 135 pounds. So with tilting it, I can get that for a single. So probably still many more years yet, but that's the main goal. So sub goals off of that would be axle, double overhand. It's a 2-inch axle, no knurling, just smooth. My goal this year, hopefully, is to hit 305. So I'd like to hit at least 300. Right now I'm at 280. And then the sub goal from there is something called the Saxon pinch bar. So imagine you've got like a 2x6 with weight you can put on the end, and it's metal. And so when you hold on to it, you have to use what's called a pinch grip. So your hands are actually open. And so the amount of thumb and open hand strength you get from that is pretty good. So my goal on that is to hit over 200 this year. Like my PR right now is like 180. And then my fourth goal, which is more or less just for fun, is to do flat dumbbell presses with the hundreds for 5 nice reps, not fugly looking horrible things. And getting closer to that. The other day I did the 90s for 6 reps, and then the PR I have on that is the 95s for 6 decent reps. So yeah, I would say it's not my main focus, but just one of those is just fun to shoot for.
Yeah, no, that's all super interesting, because usually when I have people on, these are, again, they sound like they're very performance oriented goals. A lot of people that I have on are typical, just mostly body composition, hypertrophy style. So it's super interesting to hear about this. So I have a couple questions off that.
Yeah.
So for you then, kiteboarding, right? Is that what you said? Kiteboarding? Yeah. Okay. So for that, what type of training does that involve? Is it just specific work that you need to just kiteboard, or is there like things that you can do outside of that? And I'm assuming just like strength in general probably is going to help with all that. I'm just not super familiar with it, so I don't know exactly like what it involves. So I'm just curious to hear about that a little bit more.
Totally. The good part is when you're kiteboarding, most of the force goes through a harness that you're using, but there is a fair amount of grip, just to more of an endurance type grip. And my philosophy on that is if your grip is stronger overall, endurance is going to be easier. So like the old NFL combine test, max bench press for 225. If you're going to train someone whose max bench press is 240, or someone whose max bench press is legit like 405, the guy who does 405, like 225 is way sub max. So the odds of them getting a lot more reps with just a little bit of training is much higher. So that's my bias with grip stuff, is because my other goal is 1RM specific too. That has like a nice transfer. The other component is just injury reduction. So if you screw up a jump and you get dropped out of the sky like a sack of potatoes, one, how are you going to land? And then two, if you land on your board, can you absorb that kind of impact? For example, so for squatting, I do mostly a safety bar and front squat, but I prioritize going as deep as I can, range of motion, more so than just the powerlifting type 1RM. Because for me, especially if I do on a surfboard or I'm on a wakeboard or foil board or something like that, there may be times where you have to get extremely low, or if you're getting dropped, you're going to get that compression at the bottom. And so I want to be able to try to absorb that force through as great a range of motion as possible. And then there's some endurance component to that too. The better your overall aerobic fitness is, that's going to feed into everything else. So I do a fair amount of rowing, biking, aerobic stuff, that type of thing too. And sometimes I'll flip in some specific goals on that if it's something I'm working on.
Awesome. So then in terms of like your weekly setup, how many days a week would you say you're training? What is the setup there in terms of weightlifting, like more aerobic style stuff?
Yeah. What I found is most mornings I will do a 6-minute row on the Concept 2. What I call is just a progressive row. I started doing this probably 3 or 4 years ago just to get more exposure. My bias is if you can do high quality work and you can do it more frequent, that's probably going to be better. But I didn't really want it to detract from my other lifting. And practically, I just found, if I did it at the end of my lifting session, it just normally didn't really get done. And it was a little bit too aggressive to do before the session. I could do it. I'd have to rest a little bit longer. And I found cognitive wise, I could perform better after doing some aerobic stuff in the morning. So I just do 6 minutes on there, start off pretty easy. And then by the end, you should be hitting probably about 20-ish beats below your heart rate max. So it's a decent effort, but it's something you can repeat every day. I try to do that most days a week, 5 or 6 days a week. And then Monday, I do front load, like the higher priority, high volume stuff. I actually walk to a gym to do upper body, what I call just dude bro day, use dumbbells, lots of rowing, use the machines. Those sessions are usually open-ended. So they'll be anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, just depending on what quality of work I can do. And then Tuesday, I'll do axle deadlift is the main one, and then whatever accessory lifts with that. Wednesday is normally just a cardio day. So I'll do some rowing in the morning, just maybe some bike or rowing in the afternoon. Thursday is a bench press day here. So flat, straight bar bench press, a bunch of accessory stuff, some grip stuff in there too. Friday is just another aerobic day. And then Saturday is mostly a squat and heavy pinch day. So I'll try to prioritize that. Sunday is, depending on what during the week, if I had to take one day completely off and just do walking, I'll sub in a cardio day. Or if I've done everything throughout the week and then my HRV is crappy, I might just do walking. I think there's a big benefit to just doing a completely unloaded day for vast majority of people.
Yep.
And even like the rowing, the 6 minutes isn't really that hard, but I've just noticed that having one day completely off, do some light walking, do some mobility, that seems to work pretty good.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm super excited to dive into HRV with you too, to find out what you're looking for there with that. And then when you say like you do a little bit of cardio, I feel like that can just range from a lot of different things. Is there like anything you're specifically shooting for there in that cardio?
Yeah, so right now, because I was traveling so much through May and then June, we were gone a bunch too. My goal right now is just to get back to the baseline. So for baseline, I'll base it off of my 2K time. So you can do 2,000 meters on a Concept 2 rower. That'll also give you your VO2 max. And because I've done that so much in the past, I can actually figure out what it is now off of a sub-max 6-minute time, just because I've got friggin' 4 years of data. So right now, I'm pretty much back to where my goal was before. So right now, if I had to walk into the gym and do a 2K on the rower, probably around 7:30, 7:28, somewhere in there. So if I were to prioritize rowing more, then the 2K is what I would use. So my end goal at some point is to hit the 75th percentile of everyone who logs in on Concept 2. So that would put me at a time of about 7:10. So I would probably need to cut down probably around 20 seconds. I think my PR is 7:25, I think, which doesn't sound like a lot, but after you've been training for a while, it's not something I can do anymore with just a half-assed effort. Like I literally have to stop lifting, add some more interval time, normally be in a caloric surplus, normally be at home. And I can do that if I make it a priority. I can make some pretty good progress on it. But it's at the point where now I'm just, for this phase that I'm in, since I'm getting my body weight to go back down, I'm just trying to hold wherever my aerobic development is. So the sessions on Wednesday and Wednesday and Friday are normally just what I call a cardiac development. So I will usually get on the rower again for 6 minutes, or sometimes do a 2K. Sometimes if I'm feeling really squirrely, I'll just sub out and just do 20 minutes or do a 5K. But most time lately, it's been do around a 2K and then do 20 minutes on the bike for what I call like a cardiac development. So their heart rate, I'm targeting 135 to 150 for at least 20 minutes. So it's not really zone 2. It's not high intensity. It's where I usually get a nice cardiac parasympathetic response from it, but it's not so difficult that it's going to impair my lifting the next day.
I was just going to ask you if you got into that magical zone 2 cardio there when you did that, but it sounds like it's a little bit less than that essentially.
Yeah, it's actually a higher intensity than zone 2.
Oh, it's
For me,
higher. Okay.
Yeah, zone 2 would be 120, 125. So most people, if they're doing legitimate zone 2, they're usually much lower in heart rate than what they realize.
Gotcha.
Again, there's a couple of ways to look at that. One is just, can you actually have a conversation with someone as you're doing it? If you can, the old school talk test is pretty good. You can look at what they call cardiac drift, like how much your heart rate's kind of changing over the course of it. But most people I've worked with in general, they're a little bit too intense, which again is fine. But to me, that's more of a cardiac development, and you probably want to decrease your time and probably bump the intensity up a little bit. I think zone 2 is useful. I use it more as just a baseline, but I think now some people I've seen are probably doing too much zone 2. I talked to a guy the other day. He's like, yeah, I've been doing zone 2 stuff. He's primarily bodybuilding for, I think he said almost a year at this point. He's like, my VO2 max hasn't gone up. I'm like, it probably won't anymore. It's so sub max. And if you're doing that as recovery, cool, by all means. But if you're trying to make an improvement in your cardiac or your aerobic system, 6-8 weeks of zone 2 and then just transition into some cardiac development will be a lot better, in my opinion.
Which would be like, hey, you need to get into those higher zones, correct, to be able to really develop that VO2 max more.
Yeah, so if you really want to target VO2 max, the best study I think was ever done on this was by, I want to say it was Hickson, 1988. And I think they had people with an average VO2 max of 42 milliliters per kg per minute. And at the end of the study, I want to say their average might have been 60. Just the greatest increase in VO2 max I've ever seen of any study I've ever read, period. But they weren't lifting. They were only aerobic doing stuff. And they beat the ever-living piss out of these people. Like, they had them do multiple intervals, I think at 4 to 6 minutes at 100% of your VO2 max, which is pretty damn hard. And they had them repeat that. And then I think they had one off day. I think on the other 2 days, they told them just go run as hard as you can for 40 minutes. It was periodized, but I looked at it and I was like, wow, this is crazy. And then I tried a few programs based on it, and I just literally just torched a bunch of people because they were still lifting. So if someone came to me and said, hey, I'll do whatever you tell me. My zone 2 base is good. I'm in a caloric surplus. I might lift 1 day a week to keep some muscle and strength, then yeah, I would probably do some version of that. But I've adapted it where I'll do some longer cardiac development stuff. And then if they really want to increase VO2 max, I'll have them start doing intervals at the 4 to 6 minute mark. And then usually one day we'll do some type of like actual true high intensity training. So that might be repeats at 30 seconds or 40 seconds or 60 seconds. So you're trying to hit those kind of two different ends.
So basically, it sounds like you're somebody that does want to, because a lot of people that listen to this are, again, really probably hypertrophy. They're concerned about hypertrophy. So if you were somebody, that was focused on that, but you also wanted to improve your VO2 max, you would say you probably would have to maybe choose one or the other, not necessarily one or the other, but at least, hey, you're probably not going to be able to maximize your VO2 max and hypertrophy at the same time.
Probably not, but it all depends on your level of training.
Yeah.
If I've worked with some people who their goal is just pure physique, but their resting heart rate is 68 beats per minute. They can't recover. They can only train 3 days a week. Their volume tolerance is horrible. Their sleep is good. Their nutrition is good. They can't figure out what the hell's going on. We do a VO2 max, just like a 2K or a Cooper run test, and they're literally 30, right? They're pretty damn low. And once we get that up to even just a normal level, like even 40, 45, they can usually train another day. Their quality of training goes up. Because remember, like your recovery from set to set is based a lot of times on your aerobic capacity. So the higher your aerobic is, your VO2 max, even though you're doing a quote anaerobic session, a lot of times that just limits how much volume you can do, which is a driver for hypertrophy. So for those people, I would say, hey, on your off day, we may need to run a zone 2 base for a while. If you're in that middle area and you've done some zone 2 stuff, I just have people start with just 20 minutes. Just give me 10 to 20 minutes at a moderate, decent heart rate, RPE 6 or 7. Not balls out, but pretty hard. You should be sweating pretty good by the end. And then if they really want to increase it, I would say take something like a rower, which is non-impact, also gives you your averages and everything right away. And just start at 3 minutes every morning if you can. If you've got one in your house or got one in your garage, just do that and then work up to 6-minute interval. I call like the progressive 6 minutes. So by the end of it, you should feel like it was hard, but it's doable. You could get on and do it again the next day. And I find by doing that in the morning, it's separating from the rest of their training. It won't impact their training or their quality there. It's usually easier for them to get it done. It's really not that much time. Even if they can do 6 minutes, 5 days a week, you're talking about an extra total 30 minutes. As long as your movement quality is good, you don't have pain. I don't really have people warm up. Just start a little bit lighter and just go for it.
Yeah, I've been diving in more to the aerobic side of things, like just dipping my toes in it, because I was definitely came from the background of the dude, bro. Oh, any cardio is bad. And as I learned more, it's like, man, definitely missing out on a big piece if you can incorporate some of that. So I've been trying to dive into that a little bit more. And like you mentioned there, it can help your recovery, right? You don't really think about that. I was just always under the impression that it was going to hurt your recovery, but if anything, it can help speed it up. And like you said, it can help you put in more like quality work and stuff like that.
Yeah. The biggest thing is I like people to do a baseline to see where their VO2 max is or some performance indicators, and then retest it again and see how you feel, see how you perform. Because a lot of people are doing cardio, especially in the physique world. And if you're just doing it to burn calories because you're pre-contest, okay, cool, I get it. I'm not as worried about adaptations. But if you're doing it for any other reason, you should probably look to see what are the adaptations you're getting, right? Just if you're training for hypertrophy, did your muscles actually get bigger and stronger, right? And you're primarily caring about getting bigger. So did your VO2 max get better, or was your heart rate less during the same amount of work, right? There's tons of different ways you can measure it. But a lot of times people just get on and they're like, oh, I just go until it's hard and then I'm done.
Yep.
Okay, but if you map your performance over time, your performance is actually going down. So you're actually not providing the stimulus for your body to actually get better. Same thing with training for hypertrophy. Yep. Like at some point, like all the natural guys I know, and even women, they're pretty damn strong, the people who compete. They're not powerlifter strong, but they're pretty far up there. And there's some freaks who can different ratios and stuff, but in general, like you probably need to get stronger too. And that's just the easiest thing to measure. Hypertrophy is a little bit harder to measure then.
Yep. No, absolutely. Yeah. It's super interesting. I'd love to, if we didn't have these other two topics to chat on, I'd love to chat on that a little bit, but I feel like probably some of these things, they'll probably come up a little bit more in these topics. So cool. Really cool to hear about your training background and what you like to do there. So let's dive into the first topic today. So this is one that I've heard a lot about, but I haven't really dove into it too much. And so you'd be the first person on this podcast to chat about it. Metabolic flexibility. Maybe if you just want to start with a general overview of it, and then I just have a few questions related to it there on that.
Yeah. So metabolic flexibility is looking at how your body uses carbohydrates and how it uses fats. Because my annoyance is everyone in the fitness world, it's gotten a lot better. Is it's either, oh, you got to be like super high fat, low carb, or super high carb, low fat, and you have to pick one macronutrient or the other. And the reality is your body should be able to use both. And even if your goal is more physique orientated, anyone who's done very low calorie, low carbohydrates knows how much it affects your performance. Going to the gym just generally sucks. So you want the ability to use carbohydrates for performance, because even if your goal is hypertrophy, that's going to drive your adaptations for hypertrophy as the amount of work you can do in the gym, primarily. Then also, if you're concerned about body composition, being able to use fat as a fuel is going to be much better for body composition. Of course, calories are still going to be obviously the number one thing. The metabolic flexibility is how well can you use carbohydrates on one end, how well can you use fat on the other end, And the third part is how well can you switch back and forth between the two? So if you go to the gym, can you upregulate as high as possible to use carbohydrates to fuel the performance of that session? And then when you're done, during sleep, can you downregulate to use fat more as a fuel at that point? So you're trying to get the best of both worlds from them.
And so what do you commonly see here with this? Like with, again, maybe it's somebody that is like body comp oriented. What do you commonly see here? What are some mistakes made with this concept and just, yeah, how people like apply it? And yeah.
The biggest mistake I see with people with body composition in general is actually not feeling performance and too afraid of body composition. Right. So if you have someone who's been lifting, guys or gals, like for a couple of years, you're not going to have any like newbie gains or anything like that. So my bias is while you can do some body recomp, if your lifestyle's a disaster, your stress is high, your sleep's a disaster, your training's a shit show, yeah, you can definitely improve stuff and see body recomposition changes. No question. But at some point, once you got all your ducks in a row and you're doing good, if somebody came to me and said, okay, I've got 1 year and my goal is to gain as much lean mass as possible and ideally try to lose a little bit of fat. Depending on their genetics and everything else, I would probably take 9 months and put them in a slight caloric surplus and watch performance. Try to add as much lean body mass as possible, and then 3 months and more of a caloric deficit, and then try to cut down on the other side. Like classic old school stuff that's been around forever. Doing that, however, I would still watch their metabolic flexibility to make sure that it's still good. For example, we may do some longer overnight fasts. We may do some fasted cardio. We may do higher levels of NEAT or walking, just trying to do things to keep their metabolism in order so that when we start pulling calories out, it's easier for their body to shift to use fat. And then also on the performance side, watching their performance, making sure that they probably do have enough calories, especially carbohydrates, to fuel performance. I think where most people go wrong is that they're trying to ride 2 horses with 1 ass like too long. And yeah, you can get some body recomp gains for a while, but once that stops working, to me, you've got to pick a path. Am I either going to go down or am I going to go up? Right? It doesn't mean you have to do the old Lee Priest bulking diet and go up by 70 pounds or anything crazy, but you're going to be better off by picking a path and then watching how well does your fat metabolism work and how well does your carbohydrate metabolism work.
Yeah, I guess then how would this impact your body composition if you're not metabolically flexible? Yeah, I'm curious to hear how that would affect the body composition.
Yeah, in general, it just makes doing all the things you should be doing a lot harder. For example, if you are going to so one of the things I have people do is work up to a 19 to 24 hour fast like once a week. If you have a very hard time down regulating to use fat as a fuel, you're not doing any high intensity that day, maybe just some low intensity cardio, etc. People who have a harder time down regulating to use fat tend to get much more symptomatic. They get hungrier sooner. Who knows if they really get frank hypoglycemia or not, but they get symptoms that sort of feel like that. And it becomes much harder when they're in a caloric deficit. So people I've noticed who are much more metabolically flexible, it just appears that they're more resilient, I would say, to being in a caloric deficit or longer periods of fasting overall.
Gotcha. Yeah. So again, would it be like to the point to where if somebody isn't metabolically flexible, like they may run into, again, maybe it's not necessarily anything directly that happens. It's more, okay, you're going to have a tougher time like managing hunger. So then therefore it's easier for you to potentially overeat or something like that.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, calories in, calories out still matter. But I've just noticed people are more metabolically flexible. The whole process is generally easier, not easy, but easier. Generally, their health metrics look better. Their heart rate variability tends to be better. They can usually train a little bit more. The recovery is better. Like all the things that they're trying to do to facilitate the results. I wouldn't say it's easy, but it appears to be easier compared to someone who is very metabolically inflexible.
And I guess then like, how would you, I guess 2 things off this. How do you get to be inflexible? Is it usually the way that you go about your nutrition? Is it just, again, it's like being like low muscle mass, overweight, or these things like signs and or things that will lead to that?
Yeah, there's a bunch of things. If you generally have less muscle mass, you have less of a sink to put glucose especially, and even sometimes stored intramuscular triglycerides, subcutaneous fat. Movement is a huge thing, right? So sometimes we forget that just general muscle contraction can literally pull glucose out of the bloodstream, what's called non-insulin mediated uptake. So we don't necessarily always need insulin and the GLUT4 translocation, all that kind of fun stuff. Just general walking and movement. Also with sleep, there's some very interesting studies that were done. One of them was the 2017, where they fractured somebody's sleep. Where they said, okay, this group, you sleep 8 hours, great. And the next arm of the study, they said, we're going to set an alarm that's going to go off once an hour. You hit a little button to say you hit the alarm, and then you go back to bed. Like, so they don't even really have to get out of bed, but they fracture their sleep once every hour. In the group where they fractured their sleep, their body used about 50% less body fat as a fuel source, right? Because it's a stressor, so the stress is going to move you more to the carbohydrate side of the spectrum. So even something as simple as sleep, like higher quality sleep, potentially can help body composition. Multiple studies have shown that your food selection when you've been well slept versus not slept is just generally a lot better. Anyone who's gotten a bunch of nights of poor sleep realizes that trying to make good nutrition decisions you can do it, but it's a lot more gonadal fortitude, and you're a lot more kind of white knuckling your way through. So lifestyle factors, obviously existing body composition, visceral fat, muscle mass, all those play a role into it.
Yeah, right. So I guess then let's say that somebody is in like decent shape. So again, you're going to be looking at things like at that point where you're going to be looking at like sleep and stuff like that. It's going to be those things, because if you're, again, maybe you are like have decent body composition, but again, if like things like sleep are off, these are going to be things that can make you a little bit less metabolically flexible. And I guess nutrition choices as well would macronutrients play a role as well too, in terms of how you do those? Cause I know you mentioned, hey, you have people that are just either high fat, high carb, vice versa. So I'm curious to hear about that.
Yeah, and I would say for physique goals, if somebody said, what kind of macronutrient split do you use? My bias is higher protein, right? 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of body weight. There's some pretty good data on that. The 1 gram per pound of body weight is probably more for satiety and to get all the way to the 99th percentile when you look at the data. I generally like a lower fat approach, but not super low. 50 to 80 grams per day is probably somewhere in there, which is low, but not horribly low. If you ever tried to do, back in the day, they had the ultra low fat diets of 20 grams per day, and you're like spraying your pans with Pam, and it was egg whites, and it just sucks. It was just, yeah. And there's some data to show that too low of fat, your testosterone, hormones, all that kind of stuff goes down. And then I would bias more carbohydrates, because of just if you're looking at total number of calories, carbohydrate amount is going to vary widely. Like I've had natural female competitors for physique. She was eating 200 plus grams of carbohydrates like a couple of weeks before a show. I've had guys like twice her size that were on like half that amount. Like her off season was like 350. So it just doesn't make sense, because other people, even though she has a lot of muscle mass, other people are literally like twice her size, and they're eating like half the amount of carbohydrates. So you really have to play around with it and titrate it to the person's body comp and their performance. And then if I would go one step further, I would probably use like the zigzag approach, or higher carbohydrates on lifting days, lower carbohydrates on the cardio days. If someone is trying to hedge a little bit more towards recomposition, that type of thing. But again, I would still make sure their performance is still good. I don't want to compromise their performance. The last thing, there's some interesting, although it's very mechanistic data, showing that when you overfeed people, if you overfeed them, like Atkinson did this real cool study back in the day, where they just took people and they just randomly overfed them with just a ton of carbohydrates. The people who were metabolically healthy would literally ramp up their oxidation of the carbohydrates very high. The people who weren't very metabolically healthy, they could not match that oxidation rate. When they did the same thing and put them in a surplus of fat, Kevin Hall did a study similar to this too, that the extra fat did not upregulate fatty acid oxidation or your burning of fat. It just went and got stored right away. But my bias, although why there's a little bit of data, it's more theoretical, is if you leave fat a little bit lower, you increase carbohydrates, you're getting a better performance, which is going to drive hypertrophy. It's going to burn more calories. And then if you do err and you go a little bit too high, there's a greater chance your body is going to oxidize or burn off those extra calories as carbohydrates more than it is if they were extra coming in as fat.
So it sounds like it's less about the macronutrient breakdown. It's not necessarily, hey, you need to do some higher fat days, some lower carb days. Again, you're going to match the carbohydrate intake based on like their what they're doing that day. Like you said, maybe cardio days will go a little bit lower carbohydrate, but it's less about the macronutrients is what I'm understanding here with this. It's that really doesn't play a big role in being able to be metabolically flexible.
Not necessarily. In theory, like if I wrote an article once, which I called Cockroach Fitness, right? You should be able to take in whatever fuel or whatever food and just make fuel out of it and have very little consequences from it. So one of the things a lot of people do is, could you eat 2 Pop-Tarts for breakfast and feel fine? If you feel like you want to take an insulin-induced nap under your table, you may have an issue using carbohydrates effectively. On the other end, could you go for 19 to 24 hours? You'd probably be a little bit hungry, but could you do that as a fast and still be able to perform relatively well? If you can, I think you're probably metabolically flexible. And if that's true, you're much more adaptable to whatever environment we would stick you in.
Yeah.
And there's some super interesting studies, like Levine did a study where they overfed people about 1,000 calories per day. And the short version is what they saw is some people gained a couple pounds, some people gained like 13 pounds. And what they told them was like, don't move anymore. Don't change your exercise. Just do whatever you were doing and keep doing it. And what they realize is that some people will upregulate how much they move around or their NEAT when they're overfed, the thrifty versus non-thrifty metabolism. Other people don't at all, period. So we've got this complex interaction of macronutrients also affecting how the system behaves in terms of performance. It's one of my pet peeves of all the calories in, calories out is that, yes, it's true. However, they both affect each other. And so carbohydrates, right? Most athletes in general, even physique athletes, I dramatically increase their carbohydrates and they like freak out. They're like, oh my God, I'm going to get fat. And no, you're healthy. Your VO2 max is good. You get a lot of movement. Your sleep's good, but your performance is dropping off a little bit. You can only train 3 days a week. Most of them can train 4 days a week and they get a better result overall. Now, if I did that to a general population client who maybe walks 3,000 steps a day, doesn't do formal exercise, or sleep's a disaster, they're stressed out of their mind all the time, yeah, that carbohydrate influx, their body can't handle it that well, and it's probably not going to go so good. So again, we always want to blame the macronutrient, and it is partially the macronutrient, but it's also what environment are you sticking that in? A high-level athlete is very different than Bob, whose ass looks like a couch cushion.
I love that. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Would it also, I guess the way you train too, could that play a role in metabolic flexibility?
Yeah. In general, if you want to increase your metabolic flexibility, more muscle is going to be beneficial. Obviously, lifting stuff is going to be very beneficial. VO2 max is also very beneficial. So if you have a very small or low VO2 max, like I tell clients, like, nobody remembers the Yugo, the little 3-cylinder car they had for a period of time, but a Ford Fiesta or Toyota Yaris or whatever. Like you can redline it and get to the grocery store, but you're going to cause a fair amount of stress to get this kind of average performance out of it. Where if I have a Corvette, I probably don't need to redline at all. I could go just as fast, but the stress upon the engine is way less. And I'm literally just burning more fuel at rest. So a lot of people, if we look at studies, and if you have a high VO2 max, even if we don't change the ratio that's contributing to that, fats versus carbohydrates, almost everyone in those studies see a higher percentage from fat, right? Because if you just have a bigger engine, you're just burning a lot more fuel. So I think that's another thing that people, I know I was guilty of not looking at that. I was very muscle-centric approach going, oh yeah, if you got this amount of muscle, you can add more and that's good. But a natural athlete, like how much muscle could you add per year? 5 pounds, I think you're doing good. At a high level, I have people I know who compete. Like if they could add 3 pounds of lean body mass over the next year, and this is like all they do, they would be like through the roof. They would be freaking ecstatic. So yes, that's true, but it's going to tap out at some point then also.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I guess then you went over like how to know, like you mentioned do the Pop-Tart thing in the morning, see how you feel from there. It's if you feel like crap, like right after, it's okay. Hey, there's probably something going on there. We need to improve this. And then the fasting as well, because this is going to decide how you metabolize like fat, correct? The fasting, if you can't make it for more than a couple hours, it's like, again, you're probably not, we need to work on those things. So I guess what would be, just to make sure I understand this fully. So could you have somebody that is, say their body composition is in a good spot, they're fairly lean, they have a pretty good amount of muscle. Could you have somebody like that again, they're not very metabolically flexible? And if so, and we may have already covered this, so I apologize if I'm having you repeat things. Would it be like sleep and like stress? Those would be things you would look at, or is it just maybe like the diet quality, or again maybe the way they train? Because again, I understand that if somebody is their body composition's out of whack, like the high amounts of body fat, low amounts of muscle, I could see how that person, again, they're not very metabolically flexible. But I guess where maybe we could dive in a little bit more is for somebody that is, you look on the outside, hey, generally they're in good shape. What typically are the issues that they run into, or do they even have any?
Yeah, so those are the people I typically see.
Okay.
The outside appearance, it looks pretty good. Body comp, fairly decent. Have some muscle mass, definitely more. FMI is greater than the population, but they feel like the recovery is crap. They can't really train more. They don't know what's going on. Usually, the big things we'll look at is, again, what is your VO2 max? A lot of times it's too low for their capacity. Two would also be looking at their heart rate variability or resting heart rate. If you're not doing heart rate variability, a lot of times these people are sitting at 70, 72 beats a minute, 68 beats per minute, seated first thing in the morning, which again, general population, probably good. Is that from what I see in people, I'd say that's very high. I'd want to see seated first thing in the morning, at least in the 50s for most people. So that tells me something's going on with stress. Right? You can get super fancy. You can poke them for blood lactate. My buddy Luke Lehman has done this. And some of those people their lactate levels are a little bit high, even at rest, which is telling me that they're just pushed to the sympathetic carbohydrate end of the spectrum all the time. Usually if you talk to them, if you do, like Brian McKenzie has an exhale breath test you can do for breathing mechanics. They're normally horrible at that. Like they can't downregulate. They have like squirrel brain or ADHD or whatever self-diagnosed thing, and they're just literally symptomatic, or I'm sorry, very high on the stress side all the time. So with that, a lot of times we might just, if their VO2 max is really horrible, we may just like, okay, just do 1 or 2 strength training sessions, do some zone 2. We may use some supplements to help with that. Multivitamin, micronutrients can help move some of their stress, do some breathing exercises. I'll do a lot of RPR for breathing mechanics, fix their sleep, probably bump their calories up, check their water intake, electrolytes, basically just trying to get them, because they're just running around like with a little Yugo, like redlining everywhere they go. But those are typical people I see. The last component on that, there is some very interesting studies where they took recreationally healthy people, just grabbed them off the street, stuck them in a lab, and they said, okay, at low to moderate levels of exercise, what fuel are you using? Because the question you had, which is related to this, is a good one, that my assumption before seeing these studies would be, oh, they're all primarily just using fat because they look healthy, they get some general movement, they don't have any pathologies. And what they found, Yadecki did one of these studies, Helges did one 1999, I did one 2015, those were all published. And what they see is that how well people can use fat varies from like 23 to 90%, meaning some people during that test, yeah, they can use a high percentage of fat as fuel. These are overnight fasted tests. Cool, probably pretty good to go. Some of those people are still oxidizing and burning through carbohydrates, even at a low level of exercise intensity. So even on a generally healthy recreational level, some people are still really bad at using fat as a fuel under low to moderate intensity exercise that's fasted.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess then for somebody that like, because again, I think that in the physique kind of world, it's just, again, it gets so, and I try to hit on this too. So it sounds like basically, again, we're looking at all aspects of everything, right? Just because you look good on the outside doesn't necessarily mean things are working great on the inside. So again, it just really depends on the person. And again, you're going to dive into what's going on with them, right? Is it stress related? Is it sleep related? So figuring out what that is going to be super important. So let's say that, all right, so somebody knows, okay, hey, I look good on the outside, but I'm probably not very metabolically flexible. How is that going to, what would you tell them? Hey, we need to work on this. Again, I'm sure it's going to be something that's more long-term, but I'm just curious to hear how that conversation would go. Cause they're like, hey, I look good. I don't really care at this point.
Yeah. In the past, I used to argue with people, and now I'm just like, whatever. I will show you data to try to make you more aware, and then you have to decide if it's something you want to work with or not. So we may do a resting heart rate. We'll look at heart rate variability. Most guys, unfortunately, are horrible for getting just a basic blood panel done. Okay, let's get a blood panel done. Oh, you don't even know who your physician is? We can still do it and look at it for some health markers. I have a PhD MD guy I keep on retainer to review everything for just health parameters. Because the reality is I've found telling them to go to their doctor to get blood work was almost impossible. So it's like, let's just do it. If stuff is really a train wreck, then by all means, like, you definitely need to see your doctor at that point. I just keep doing stuff, run a VO2 max, even stuff like, when's the last time your lifts got better? If you're trying to get bigger biceps, like, when's the last time you actually saw an increase in bicep circumference? Like, I just keep measuring stuff and showing them the data. And at some point, they either want to work on it or they don't. If they're still like, I don't care, I'm making good gains and my health's a train wreck, you do you, man. Like, I'm not gonna argue with you anymore. Where in the past, I used to argue with people and be like, oh my God, you're doing that. And I'm like, if you're cool with it, then I guess I'm okay with it. I think it's wacky, but I know everyone has their own value judgments. And that's one thing. If you're an elite level athlete and you're making multi-million dollars per year or more, and you have to perform on Sunday, I get performing with some level of pain. If you're the average person lifting in the gym and your elbow's been bothering you for 4 weeks and you keep doing the thing that aggravates it, I think that's pretty stupid. Everyone has to learn for themselves.
Yep. No, absolutely. Yeah. It sounds like not really necessarily going to argue with them about it. Just like, hey, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going on. And at that point, it's ultimately up to you if you want to decide to work on that aspect or not. Again, maybe didn't like, so I guess, is there going to be any health implications down the line potentially with this too? Anything that again, maybe you can use like a scare kind of tactic in a way too? Hey, if you don't fix this, these are some potential issues that you could run into long term.
You can. The ironic part is I found that it doesn't work that well, which is weird.
Right.
There's a whole book written on this. I'm blanking on the exact name of the book, but you would, and then the book had something to do with, I think it was a cardiologist who wrote the book who showed that people would come in with all these risk factors. And his assumption was he would present all this data to people and they would do a 180 and go fix their life. And that definitely does happen, but it's not the norm, which is weird. So what you usually find is people will accept it and they're like, okay, what are some things I can do? Or they'll try to argue about the validity of the data and they'll send you all these studies that are one-off, three-eyed gray rat studies about where this HDL wasn't a factor or whatever. And they're literally just trying to, because if they dismiss the data to their brain, they don't have to do anything. Like if you looked at, they used to call it the Prohaska model of change or the trans-theoretical model of change. And it's basically like stage one is don't care, don't know, whatever. Like stage 2 is you're talking about making a change, but you're not doing any actions yet. And normally, and I've screwed this up in the past, like if you say quitting smoking, right? So say someone wants to quit smoking and you're like, stage 1 is, I don't care about quitting smoking. I'm going to smoke the rest of my life. Screw you. Stage 2 would be, I should think about quitting smoking. And ironically, if you point out that, hey, you haven't tried to quit smoking at all. You're telling me this as you lit up a cigarette. You would think that would drive them to change, and it actually drives them the other way. They're almost like, F you, I'm going to smoke as much as I want. You're not going to tell me what to do. Where stage 3 would be, okay, now they're actually doing some of the actual change. They're doing some of the action. So even just realizing that, I'll bin people and look at what they say, but more at what they do. So if they start doing more things that are active, great. If they're only at stage 2, then the only thing you can really do is just keep helping them with education. It's like the old saying, you can't force a horse to drink water, all that kind of stuff. So it's hard. And it's harder when they're clients. It's harder when they're family and friends and you know what's going on. But like all this stuff we're asking them to do, it's difficult. And everyone's going to be at their own process of where they're at.
Yep. No, 100% on that. Is there anything that maybe that I missed asking you or anything else that you think like the audience should know about like metabolic flexibility? Maybe something that, I didn't ask or something we didn't cover.
No, not really. If people are interested, I have a whole certification on it. You can just
Yep.
go to flexdiet.com and walk you through all the 8 different interventions, give you some background on the theory, and then we have 40 explicit action items. So basically tell you exactly what to do in a flexible based approach.
Cool. Yeah, no, absolutely. And before I let you go too, we'll talk about places where people can find you and your certifications. But yeah, 100%, we'll make sure that we link that. With the little bit of time that we have left, I just wanted to briefly, you hit on it a couple times throughout, was recovery, HRV. And I feel like this is definitely a hot topic, trendy topic in fitness. So if you can maybe just go over what it is and why you think why it can provide such like value to insight into your body and things like that.
Yeah, HRV is, to me, probably, especially if you're training clients online, I think is probably one of the most useful metrics, I would say, right behind performance. So the reason I always monitor performance is because that's an output of what your physiology is capable of. And even if your goal is hypertrophy, if you can do more volume, you can do a higher quality of work, you can do that more frequent, all the data we have says that you're definitely going to get bigger muscles at some point, right? You get into intricacies within that and long muscle length and blah, 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 blah. But it's mostly the amount of high quality work you can do by and large. So right after performance or some type of output your body is able to do, VO2 max to V1, what is the cost of doing said performance, right? So what is the stress? If I have my little car, I can do 60 miles per hour, but what does the tachometer say? I'm in a Corvette where it's like 2,000 or 3,000 RPMs, or I'm in a little Yugo where it's like 7,000 and I've redlined the car. They're both going the same speed, so the output is the same, but what did it take to get to that output? I think a lot of times that's what people forget, right? Especially for hypertrophy training, you'll see people who do good for a while, they do good on a program, and if you watch their caffeine intake, it's like this exponential thing, and they're trying to do all this stuff to fix their poor recovery by just putting more nitrous in a small little engine, right? But they don't know that they're doing that. They don't know what the cost is. And they're not looking at the tachometer at all until the wheels fall off and they can't figure out what the hell happened. So HRV is a good marker for what is the cost of all the things you're doing in the system, from sleep, recovery metrics, nutrition, psychological factors, all of that. And the nice part is you can do it on a daily basis. It's non-invasive, takes about 3 minutes to do. Once you have the device or the software to do it, doesn't cost you any more money to do it. Yeah, in theory, I could run a cortisol panel every morning, but that's going to cost me money, and I got to send the thing out, and I got to wait for it to come back, and maybe it's okay to map it out one time, but it's not useful on a day-by-day measure. So with heart rate variability, you're looking at simply what is the stress on the system? How much are you parasympathetic, rest and digest recovery? How much are you on the sympathetic or stress side of the equation? And then from there, you can decide what it is you want to do about that. For example, like this week, Monday was a longer session than I normally have in the gym, which was fine. I had a bunch of work stuff I had to finish, so I ended up working until like about 9 o'clock that night. And I was just dragging on Tuesday. And my schedule got a little bit jumbled. I didn't have as much time. So I just said, okay, I'm going to flip Tuesday and Wednesday. I'm going to do my cardiovascular training, which I know doesn't impact my HRV as much on Tuesday. And I'm going to do my heavier lifting on Wednesday, and Thursday I'm back to a normal schedule. So I just flipped the two. And the reality was it went just fine. But without a lot of experience or having a marker to look at that, I probably wouldn't have figured that out. It's just going to take them a lot of time to figure out what is really truly intuitive training. And a lot of, not to rip on younger people, but intuitive training I find in people who don't have a lot of experience is just them doing more bicep curls because they want to do bicep curls.
Yep. No, so again, this is a way to objectively look at like your just overall like recovery and again, like seeing how that's going. Because you do hear a lot about how, oh, hey, you need to recover better, your stress is too high, but there's really not a good way to objectify that. And this is a way to be able to do that, to see how you're recovering and again, ensuring that you're training and performing as best as you can. And if it's not a great greeting, it's, hey, we got to work on some recovery methods and focus on that side of thing versus just keep hammering away at things like you said. Cause I feel like you said, when you first get into training or you don't really have a great understanding of all this stuff, you don't really think of that side of things, right? It's just, oh, you just have to train hard all the time. And that's what you need to do. But that's obviously not going to lead you to where you want to go. So HRV can be a way to help objectify that essentially.
Yep. And it gives you a physiologic marker of what is your response of your system. Now, the hard part is it won't tell you what. So it could be you had an argument with your spouse. It could be you
Right.
just don't get enough movement. Maybe you get too much movement. Maybe you're turning too close to failure. It can be a lot of things. So it's not going to tell you necessarily what, which is why the devices I like have a context indicator below where you self-rate energy level, sleep, etc. So when I get data from clients, I get resting heart rate, I get heart rate variability, which is a marker of stress on their autonomic nervous system, and then I get the indicators below it. So from there, I can then ask questions about, oh, looks like your training performance was good, nutrition was good, HRV dropped over these 2 days, and you self-report that your sleep was poor that night. Now, if I have an Oura Ring or a Garmin, I'll pull their data, look at their sleep data for that night. And if we see this pattern keeps showing up, okay, now we know that's affecting your performance. So let's work on that because everyone's an individual. I've seen some people, honestly, their nutrition was a floating trash bin fire and they seem to do okay. I've seen other people do ungodly amounts of volume. I had a professional, was a female physique athlete. She literally did more high quality volume than like any guy I've ever worked with, like period to this day. Her HRV was generally pretty good and her output like was pretty good, but she was doing about twice what most guys I would have at her level. So again, without monitoring some of this stuff, there's no way I would have, no way I would have known that. It probably would have taken me way too long to figure it out that she just responded a lot better to high volume and she could tolerate it and did fine.
Because otherwise you're just going off of what the client says at that point. And is that the best way to go about it? Because sometimes people aren't great at like actually figuring that out themselves. So I could see where like having that, again, that objective data there can be super helpful with that. So how would you interpret the HRV data? Are we shooting for, do you have a certain number we're going for here? What does that look like?
The hard part is there are some averages, but it depends on what system you're using. And so I use the iFleet system for athletes mostly. That'll put it on a 1 to 100 scale. Oura does HRV, it does it pretty accurately, but if you have clients who have a low resting heart rate, they'll get something called parasympathetic saturation, meaning that they have this high vagal parasympathetic tone at night that other stressors don't show up too well in the measurement. Again, if you've got a resting heart rate of 60 or 70, you're probably fine. But I've got one client who's an obstacle course racer, like his resting heart rate at night is like 36, so his Oura very rarely changes. So we have to have him do a commanded measurement actually in a standing position in the morning. But once you get that figured out, you're just looking at changes from baseline. So you can be too low or too high. You can actually be too parasympathetic and actually too sympathetic. Most people just think about, oh, I'm just too much on the stress side.
Right.
But there are some weird things that can happen where if you're parasympathetically too high, you just feel shut down. Like your performance sucks, you feel tired. And those are even more confusing because a lot of times people don't know what's going on then. They're like, what? But knowing that, you can go, oh, we've seen this response before. Some of the parasympathetic stuff will clear within 1 or 2 days. If it's a sympathetic, then you're looking at more restorative things. Maybe we'll bump your calories. Maybe we'll have you take a nap. Maybe we'll have you do some breath work, some meditation. Maybe we'll flip your training, chop your volume in half, drop some high intensity sets, drop any high intensity methods, sub in cardio. Because to me, like I want to look at the long-term programming and make sure that generally stays on track, even for physique athletes. If you're doing a competition day, then who cares? It's competition day. You can take a week off after that. But if you do things where you implode yourself, and then now you need 7 days of rest and recovery to get back to baseline, to me, those big setbacks are what really hose people up overall.
And I guess for somebody that is body comp focused, like having your HRV be off, whether again, like you just mentioned there, you can also be too parasympathetic, but I would imagine, like you said, most people probably fall on the too like sympathetic side of things, correct? That's
usually, yes.
So like, how would that impact like body composition if you are finding that you're too high there on that?
It just impacts the amount of high quality work you can do.
Okay.
So if you're really sympathetic, acutely, sometimes your performance will be better, but you usually can't repeat it the next day or the day after. So I did a talk in, what was it, 2017, I think, for basically it was a physique seminar. So it was all high level bodybuilders, coaches, etc. And I gave a keynote talk on how to use heart rate variability. And most of the audience was like, oh, that's pretty cool. But some people were like, this doesn't make any sense, because you're a physique athlete. Nobody gives a shit what your HRV is when you're on stage. I'm like,
Right.
correct. But most of you are training people in an online environment. And yeah, if you worked with someone who's done a bunch of shows and they're very good at giving feedback, yeah, you don't need it. But if they're new and they don't know, they haven't really been through the process maybe once or twice, my argument was, if they're 16 weeks out and their HRV is just going in the absolute crapper, they're pretty hosed, right? Like, you either need to address it now, or something not so good is going to happen. Versus everybody's HRV goes in the shitter before the show. They actually become hyper parasympathetic like right beforehand, due to fluid intake and overtraining and a whole bunch of other stuff. But the closer we can get that to happen before the show, the higher quality their training can be, the better the recovery. I would argue probably less muscle mass loss, all of those things. But it just gives you a marker to look at. No, nobody cares that your HRV is on stage. But if it's going off the rails 16 weeks out, I would rather know then versus have the wheels fall off 8 weeks out. And then, so now what do you do?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's going to affect your ability to really have that quality training, which, like you said there, could lead to some muscle loss. And that's obviously not going to be great from a body composition standpoint. What do you recommend to get to track this?
For athletes, I was still like using the iThlete system. Instead of athlete, it's iThlete with an I. You will need a little finger sensor or heart rate strap. Do it first thing in the morning after you use the bathroom. Most people are going to do it in a seated position. If your resting heart rate is like well below 40, you might have to do it standing up. But most people will be fine just doing it in a seated position, and then follow the little on-screen thing for just a couple minutes. Yeah.
I know we didn't get to dive into this too much. I know you have to hop off here, but is there anything that you would like leave the audience with for HRV? Is there anything maybe that like you think is most important, or even to like, where can they find out more about HRV as well too?
Yeah, I have an HRV education course that's it's a little bit shorter than the Flex Diet Cert or the Phys Flex Cert. It goes through all the basics of what you would need to know. We do some examples in there too. And so that's been helpful for a lot of people, because it is a confusing topic. And I purposely don't spend hours in there talking about what is variability analysis, and do you do this time domain method versus that method versus the calculating the raw math in the back end. And all that stuff is part of my PhD, and wrote a friggin' MATLAB algorithm to do some of the shit. But nowadays you don't have to know any of that stuff, but you do have to understand the basics of it. And once you understand the context, then when you see changes, you know what to do. So it's not as easy as, oh, they're stressed, just do this or do that. There is some context you have to understand. But once you do that, like, you, especially online, you just appear like this know-it-all Mr. Wizard, where you're like, oh, I bet today you're probably feeling tired and your lifts were a little bit lower. They're like, oh my God, how did you know that? And so if there is any online training superpower, it's the ability to accurately predict what's going to happen to a client. Even if you can just do that a couple times, like the huge amount of buy-in from that.
Yep. No, absolutely. Cool. So you have a specific HRV certification that you do, and you go through all these things basically in more detail. Cool. We'll make sure we link that. Was there any other things you want to leave the audience with in terms of certifications, or where else they can find you?
Yeah, this place is just MikeTNelson.com. Most of the stuff I have written now goes out on a daily newsletter, which is mostly content based. So there's a bunch of different links they can hop on there, and that's where most of the content is. And tell me you heard me on the show here, and we'll send you a cool free gift too.
Awesome. Cool, Dr. Mike. Really appreciate your time. A ton of great information. I'm definitely going to check out the HRV cert for sure, and everything else you have. So again, appreciate your time, and we'll chat with you next time.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.